Okay, so our final short paper is Dr. Christopher Bennett talking about evolution's revenge, large numbers, COVID, and epistemology. So 20 minutes over to you. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Is there a clock I can see? Perfect. I'll try and keep an eye on it. So I want to start by asking you, and this is, don't worry, I'm not going to do full audience participation, but I want to just ask you to sort of think about what's the biggest number of people that you've seen in one place in the flesh. I think for most people it's probably going to be around 50,000. I'm guessing sort of like a big concert, big sporting fixture. For those of us lucky enough, some of us might have been to the new camp, which might have seen about 100,000 people in the flesh in one place. But I think, and some people, maybe some of you are even thinking of sort of like a huge political protest. I'm thinking sort of like the Iraq War had almost 1 million people going through the city of London. Brexit, I probably shouldn't mention Brexit, but I'll not do it again. Brexit, which had sort of hundreds of thousands of people. But I don't think you could maybe claim to see those people all in one place, because maybe unless you had a helicopter, I guess. So if I say that 100,000 people tested positive for COVID on a certain day, how do you try to sort of visualize that concept? Maybe you think about that entire huge football stadium of people getting sick in one day. Maybe you think about it as a sort of a percentage of the population at large. I know a lot of people like to think of it as sort of if you walk down the street and you sort of come across 20 people, one of them is infected with COVID. So I think what I'm going for here is that when confronted with enormous numbers, the brain gropes for the familiar, the conceivable, things it understands. And that's obviously very cognitively normal and also very useful. And forgive me any sort of educationalists in the room, because you'll be very familiar with this. But so again, no sort of like shouting out required, but a bit of audience participation. So if you could look at that top left square, just look at it and think, how many dots are there? Okay, it's 2, right? How many dots are in the bottom right square? You look at it and you think 4, right? If you look at the bottom left, you should be able to look at that and immediately see 5. If you look at the top right and ask how many dots there are, you might find that you actually start counting. Rather than just looking at it and saying, oh, well, there's 4. You actually look at that and think, I need to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now you can probably do that quite quickly. I hope you can all do that quite quickly. But that's called subitizing, and there's a limit of about 5. It does vary from person to person, of how many numbers you can, the number that you can easily sort of look at and visualize and see. And I'm going to argue that the way in which humans deal with numbers can have really unexpected consequences for how human knowledge structures dealt with COVID. And that we can draw an interesting parallel between the way in which we dealt with COVID and the way we treat God. I want to take a moment just to make clear that I won't be aiming to criticize different responses to COVID, the pandemic, the large numbers it brought. I just want to describe them. I'm going to sort of stay firmly on the is side of the is-ought fork. The perceptions that I state will be in service of my sort of wider point, which is that COVID, I think, revealed an intriguing aspect of human nature, and one which can often also be seen in the field of theology. Richard Dawkins famously said that humans are evolved to cope with medium-sized objects moving at medium speed through medium distances in Africa. So this view is based on an understanding of humankind as having evolved in a particular context for particular tasks, as has further been shown by evolutionary biologists such as Gold or Hazelton. Evidence of this can be seen in certain cognitive biases, such as the error management bias, where you'll go for the less costly errors, which might mean you actually generate more errors. The subitizing task I showed you earlier would be another example. Beyond 5, the brain simply has to process things in different fashion, and that's got an evolutionary reason for it. So what relevance does this bear for COVID? Well, I'm going to start by looking at some of Robin Dunbar's work on primate cortexes, neocortexes, and group size. So if we have a quick look at this chart, so along the x-axis, you've got size of the neocortex relative to the rest of the brain, and on the y-axis, we've got average group size of that species. And he's plotted various primates along here, and you can see humans, monkeys, apes as some examples. And the line of best fit is pretty clear. I mean, it's not one of the more dubious lines of regression I've seen. And you can see where it comes out to when you plot humans' size of neocortex relative to the rest of the brain, and their average social group size, and it comes out to be about 150. You can even the evidence of this can actually be seen through human evolution. So if you look at this chart, you've actually got hominids along the x-axis here, and some more developed apes along the x-axis, and then community size along the y-axis. And as you can see, as we go from sort of Homo erectus, Homo heidelberg, Neanderthals a bit of a step backwards, but then to the modern humans, you can see community size increases. And again, that's because of the neocortex. The thought there is that the neocortex is where the theory of mind is mostly calculated. And theory of mind is very important for socializing. So you need to have a very developed neocortex. The interesting thing about this one is that I think social psychology usually isn't great with evidence, but actually you can see this in the fossil records. So that's quite good evidence. I should say, just as sort of an aside, Dunbar has actually applied this work to religion. It's not entirely relevant for this talk, but I thought it's a fun little look at. And so this is looking at 19th century cults in America. Ignore the white dots for now, but the black dots are religious cults in America. And their size at foundation, you can see when the size of foundation is about 150, they tend to last longer. They tend to have more of a sort of staying power, and that again suggests that this group size of 150 is something that really helps humans to sort of bond and gel. The white dots are actually secular cults, and again there's something here that Dunbar's perhaps inferring from this data, which is that religious groups, as opposed to non-religious groups, help you to find that optimal group size. I don't have time to go into that particularly interesting study at the moment, though. What I always love about this chart, though, is you can see these three white dots at the bottom. These are cults that lasted one day. It doesn't really count as a cult, really, does it? The implications of this research, I think you've got to treat them with a heavy pinch of salt. People love to take Dunbar's number in all different directions. The Swedish government, for example, reorganised all of its departments to have teams of 150 people. I'm not sure Dunbar approves of that. And also, it would be remiss of me not to point out that there are critics of Dunbar's theory. Patrick Lindenfors, who actually is Swedish as well, is one of them. But the view does retain popular support in evolutionary psychology circles. And it does seem that there is a limiting tendency on our social capacities placed on us by evolutionary necessity and our neurological structures. It's just the sort of placing an exact number on it, which can seem quite implausible. So my contention for this talk is that due to evolutionary reasons, humans struggle to cognize large numbers in a sensible fashion, especially when they're pertaining to people. So I'll quickly return to the new camp. At the height of the pandemic, the UK actually suffered 40 days where a new camp full of people, or more, were testing positive for COVID on that day. The problem is, but beyond a certain number, the impact of the number of infections is sort of lessened, I feel like. I know the Office for National Statistics, and I'm sure many of you will know as well, it put out statistics mentioning that sort of 1 in every 25, 1 in every 15, 1 in every 10 people had COVID, which was aiming to bring to mind the ideas of, again, that thing I mentioned earlier about walking down the street and you see 100 people and 4 of them are infected. This approach that the ONS took was actually for the exact reason that it was felt in government that people failed to comprehend the full gravity of the huge numbers that they were being given. And I'm sure we did all find that those ONS translations to be sort of more comprehensible were maybe more grounded and more helpful. So going to some of those incredibly large numbers then. Now, I can recognise sort of that 100,000 over there is more than 1,000 over there. I mean, I know that it's 100 times more, despite a theology degree. I do know that. But when I hear on the news that 1,000 people have been infected, and then I hear some months later that 100,000 people have been infected, I don't think the magnitude of my reaction is appropriately larger. It's not, certainly not 100 times larger, right? I'm sure many of you would have also noticed this phenomenon amongst yourselves, where once it seemed that sort of around here, when we were at 10, 20, 30,000 daily cases, that was sort of real cause for alarm. After the onset of the Omicron variant over there on the right of the graph, Case numbers regularly hit 50, 60, 70,000, and we sort of took no notice. There's certainly an effect of sort of banality and normalisation going on here, but I would also contend that actually the main factor at play is the simple human inability to reasonably compute large numbers as referring to real people that you could sort of actually have a connection with. I'll look at that sort of Omicron variant, and here's some even larger numbers. So this is the ONS's study, which again you might be familiar with, which was trying to get an idea of actual number of people infected rather than positive tests, and those numbers are even more sort of incomprehensible, I think. You can see after the UK sort of began living with COVID from February, it was notable that the big numbers just didn't seem to matter so much. And the numbers themselves are still astronomical, but I think the reason it didn't seem to matter is because the numbers weren't what was important. I think what people tended to view as a surge was based more on sort of their personal experience, those they knew. How many times in the pandemic did it feel like everyone you knew was going into self-isolation at once? I know I had a few such occurrences where all of my friends were suddenly sort of locked in. And that certainly stoked the fear that the virus is everywhere. And I think it stoked the fear far more than 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, big numbers of people. And in fact, some of those outbreaks in my friend groups weren't necessarily correlated with the big surges that you would see across the nation. And I think that feeling is quite ubiquitous, and it's based on that evolutionary biological urge to compute within our groups of 150 and extrapolate from our groups of 150 rather than actually trying to sort of compute those really large numbers. The effects of this failure of human cognition were many and varied. I don't want to dwell on these too long, as I believe it might still be too early to judge some of them. But in immediate responses to the pandemic, I think you could argue that public perception failed to appreciate fully the horrors to come, because I think an oncoming 50,000 seems just as terrifying as a current 1,000. Conversely, I think in the throes of lockdown, I think there were times when there wasn't enough appreciation of sort of when we had it good, because I think that there was the idea that if we squished it back down to the hundreds or the thousands, that's still a very large number, and that's still sort of equally terrifying, and it's still more than our sort of 150. So you couldn't really celebrate the significant reductions. You were still stuck thinking, wow, that's a very large number. I think others obviously just see large numbers and they switch off. It would seem that only through that occurrence could we sort of casually acknowledge that 150,000 people died related to COVID since March 2020. I think it's really hard to deny that even if you set apart evolutionary biases about avoiding infection, things like that, our perceptions and reactions to the COVID pandemic are really coloured by our evolutionary past and this Dunbar's number theory. So, what are some theological consequences? I think there's some really intriguing ones here. So I think one that directly links to the large numbers of COVID is about compassion. And Jesus obviously told Christians to love their neighbours. But what does this mean? I mean, neighbours are easier to love than strangers, usually. And this, again, sort of has an evolutionary origin. We prioritise the in-group for a whole host of reasons, but there's also a cognitive limitation. I think we struggle to relate to more than that 150 people or around that number. How can Christians also love their strangers as well as their neighbours? How can they do that when they're so sort of innately drawn to these manageable groups of people? They're sort of groups of 150. Will any love shown to people outside of those groups always be sort of detached or abstracted in some way? And then I think another theological consequence is when people try to think about heaven. You tend to sort of imagine clouds, pearly gates, people, white robes, something a bit like this. I'm very pleased that I found this cartoon. It ties the whole talk together. But of course, this isn't really what theologians think heaven looks like. I'm of course sort of far from the first to make this point that this isn't what heaven looks like. But eternal life and companionship with God is a very tricky cognitive concept, just as 4 million people infected with COVID is a very tricky cognitive concept. And they both extend far beyond anything for which evolution has prepared humanity. So the wider point for theology and philosophy that I want to make is that humans are limited by our evolutionary pasts. a large number of people and the consequences that social policies would have on those large numbers of people might be really difficult to comprehend in a way that recognises the individual personhood of those people. But what is clearly more incomprehensible is an infinite and eternal God who utterly defies categorization. Indeed, whether or not it is possible through sort of concentrated effort and reflection to apprehend some part of God's person, it's a difficulty that has been endlessly expressed. Some you've got, such as Wittgenstein, would argue that it's sort of a limitation of language. Others, like Kant, would posit it's a sort of limitation of rational argumentation. But I want to argue that that's a limitation of humanity's evolved capacities. And just as the way that people struggle to grapple with and properly grasp huge numbers, I think that COVID threw upon us, I think also humanity is sort of eternally struggling with God as a concept and as a notion. And that designates an evolutionary boundary that we're butting up against. Thinking about an omnipotent, omnipresent being, it's simply not something that humans were evolved to do. Now, I'm aware that view and some of the language I've used in those last couple of paragraphs will be quite controversial. It can be sort of seen as very scientistic, sort of dismissive of human capacities. I do want to distance myself from those sorts of views, and the way I do that is I'd like to draw a parallel with what I've been talking about so far. I think it seems quite blatant to me that the evidence of what we've seen, how people respond to the COVID pandemic, that tells us a lot about human nature, and it tells us about how we relate to others. It tells us about how we understand big numbers. If you can accept that the failures of comprehension in these areas led to much of the fear, the resentment, the acceptance of what was happening over the past 2 years, and that those have evolutionary reasons, I don't think it's a stretch to imagine that similar factors could be at play in other areas. Given that humanity's evolutionary history makes health policy in a pandemic difficult, so too it also makes philosophical theology complex. Not to accept the limitation in one area while also accepting it in another would resemble for me something like special pleading. At its most modest, my conclusion then is only to state that the way in which humans deal with God beliefs is through the filters of an evolved brain, one which has no necessity to accurately comprehend such an incomprehensible object. And just to wrap up, in the words of a very wise lady, so what? Much of this might already be obvious to anyone that's sort of paying attention to biology or theology. Of course, humans struggle to juggle large numbers, and of course, God is beyond human comprehension. I agree that both those conclusions should be quite uncontroversial, but I think it's worth noting where new ways can be found to old conclusions, to strengthen them and find a coherence between the scientific view and the religious doctrine. Moreover, I think it's really interesting to take notice of current events. I couldn't have picked anything much more current, other than maybe sort of theological consequences of the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial. I don't know. That would have been really current. And to point out, but I'd really like to point out where there's current events and then there's theological consequences are emerging in real time. Particularly as I think the COVID pandemic is very likely to be remembered as the most significant event of the first half of the 21st century, I'm sure. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts, your questions, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Chris. We'll open the floor to questions. Can I just ask that you repeat the question before you answer it so it picks up from that?
Yeah.
Andrew.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed that. Does it depend on what we mean by comprehend? So going back to your early diagrams, reminds me of, is it Daniel Kahneman's distinction between slow thinking and fast thinking? So when we think fast, we get a kind of instant emotional perception, intuition, which might be very different from if we apply our slower mathematical reasoning. That strikes me as being very, very different from our ability to understand things outside space and time, like God, who's beyond being. So it's not just a case of linear extrapolation to infinity, it's an entirely different problem of not being able to think at all, let alone slow thinking.
Yeah, I agree. I think definitely there's a big connection between the sort of thinking in the sort of type 1, type 2 processing. I think that the only thing I'd say about that, though, is a lot of people in their reactions to COVID and in their religious beliefs are engaging in that sort of type 1 thinking. And I think it's very easy not to know when you're doing one and when you're doing the other. There isn't a sort of a switch that you flick in your head. And you can often get quite confused because beliefs that you might generate through type 1 thinking would still continue into your type 2 reflections. And you might be thinking more scientifically, more mathematically, more sort of reflectively about things, but that doesn't mean that you wouldn't still have the hangovers of sort of type 1 instinct.
Thanks very much indeed. I very much enjoyed that. Lots of food for thought. I just wonder whether your analysis of the COVID, people's reactions to COVID, if there are perhaps two complicating factors in that which you didn't really discuss. One was the shift, as I recall, in reporting of COVID from excess deaths to infections. There's nothing that focuses the mind more than excess deaths as opposed to infections. So I wonder if there's a kind of a change in people's perceptions associated with that shift, and also the effect of vaccination. And once people realised that vaccination did prove a very effective counter to COVID. So I wonder how you would feed those two factors into your analysis.
I'll start with the second one and then I'll work back to the first. So I think with vaccination, I think there's definitely something going on there with people feeling more safe, people sort of feeling protected. But I think if you sort of can cast your mind back to October, November, December last year, there was still a lot of fear. There was, I think, a lot of that, and most people had 2, even 3 jabs at that point. And I think a lot of that fear was still from the rising numbers. It was, I think, only when Omicron really took hold and the numbers just became utterly astronomical, like almost a factor of sort of 3 or 4 from previous numbers, that people, it almost just sort of disappeared as a concern. I mean, sort of post-Christmas type thing. I'll go back to your first thing, which is that I entirely agree that there's a lot of other factors at play here. I think deaths obviously are much scarier when people see them on the news, when people are thinking about things in that way. Entirely agree with that. And I also think that there's, as I sort of very briefly mentioned, but should probably disclaimer more, there are obviously lots of things going on. I think people just generally get used to whatever the status quo is as well, which I think is another thing that's going on here. But I think the way in which the sort of the numbers were something that people at the beginning of the pandemic seemed really to be very scared of, but didn't seem to get sort of linearly more scared of as they got higher and higher. I think that's something that is related to the way we sort of relate to people.
Now, I think the Omicron variant I think the numbers became astronomical, but the associated deaths didn't. And that seems to me to be perhaps one reason why the numbers didn't have the impact that earlier.
Yeah, quite possibly. Yeah.
I'm just thinking about people's behaviour in groups of numbers, which would relate to this. When I was stewarding the vaccination centres, sometimes we had small numbers, sometimes we had queues, and sometimes we had very, very large numbers. And there was a point where it got scary, and people's behaviour changed. It might have been about that 100, where suddenly the behaviour of the same people changed. Are we sort of anonymous in a crowd that size, or not responsible, or we change our behaviour? Whereas with 40, we are ourselves.
No, I think that's exactly correct. So there's some really interesting stuff that I've not properly looked into, which is police forces trying to use Dunbar's number, and it is sort of like, well, around 150. If you sort of kettle people into groups of 150, they're sort of okay. Past that, it's a mob. And I think it's that sort of depersonalization, and it's the lack of relation to other people that happens when you feel you're in a big enough crowd, and it might be around that sort of 150 that is the turning point, because that's exactly what it's about. It's about how many people can you sort of hold in your head as intentional social beings that also exist as people, rather than just being a mob.
And then in a sense I don't exist as a person
Yeah.
the same way in that crowd, so I behave differently.
Yeah.
I mean, we had one day when I was quite seriously worried we were about to have a riot.
Mm-hmm.
These quite respectable people, but it got out of hand. I had to say, "That's right, you can't run it like this. It's going to go."
Yeah. No, I think that's and I think equally you can connect that to the sort of communities that people live in now, which are significantly larger, and maybe people do lose a sense of sort of community identity because they're outside of these smaller sort of community groups.
All these queues into the same room.
Yeah.
Instead of separate rooms.
Yeah, and exactly. Yeah, whereas if you keep them in different queues, maybe everyone stays more organised. Yeah.
Kind of fascinating, particularly your analysis of the COVID. The question mark I have is over your link with understanding God and such like. I just wonder about your statement about being evolved to cope with the thinking about God.
Yeah.
I'm just aware that religion seems to be all pervasive along with culture, and I just wondered whether there has been some sort of evolutionary part of us evolving about religion as well. So about my question, I don't know.
Yeah. So I think certainly we have evolved to think about God. It's whether we've evolved to think about God in the way that a lot of sort of classical theism would perceive God. A lot of the ways in which we've evolved to think about God are anthropomorphized, are sort of very agent-based, right? It's sort of God as the shepherd, God as the father. These are the ways in which people have evolved to think about God, God as the man who brings the lightning type thing, right? And those aren't necessarily the same ways in which Christian sort of philosophical theology would like to think about God. So I would agree that we've evolved to think about God, and actually you can look at that Dunbar's research on how it's actually beneficial to group sizes, and heaps of other research too. But it's not evolved to think about the sort of Christian omni-everything God in the same way that it's more of a sort of pantheistic view. I think we've evolved towards. Yeah. Thanks.
I'm going to take Chair's prerogative now. Picking up on that idea of it's a follow-up really, that kind of idea of evolving to think of something.
Yeah.
As you said, we've evolved to not cope with that very large and that very difficult to cap, I suppose.
Yeah.
To what extent do you think that this idea of us being sort of limited in our capacity to hold the supposed infinite, how does that respond to things like Braithwaite's explanation that religion is a psychological aid, so we're using it to support our understanding of the world, to make us feel better? How does that square with the fact that actually we're talking about something that we can't conceptualise?
Yeah, I think Braithwaite's view of things is probably correct, but again, I'd go back to it's sort of what are people using religion for? And when people are thinking about religion, they're sort of using their type 1 processing a lot of the time. It's quite instinctive. That I'm not sure a lot of sort of ordinary believers are really sort of reflecting constantly on their beliefs because why would they? They might be sort of reading the Bible and sort of picking out bits, but it isn't sort of a really philosophical sort of treatise type thinking, and that thinking might be more sort of God as a protector, and that's sort of useful psychologically in many ways, but it isn't quite the same as reaching towards the sort of eternal, outside of time God that, again, sort of classical theism would maybe point towards.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? In that sense, I think we'll say thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.